ironclad development from the dawn of the ironclad era to the start of the pre-dreadnought era is only maybe 35 years or so, give or take. But it is an incredibly complicated affair. Far too complex to be covered in any one video. So instead, over the next few months or possibly years, we're going to have to trace through the development of capital ships and armoured ships by nation, as the developmental stories of ironclads in the British, French, American, Russian and Italian and other navies are all quite different in terms of character, pace and volume, with occasional references obviously in any given video as to what other nations were doing when it affects the particular nation that we're talking about. And even then, it's only possible in about an hour to briefly cover part of that story for the larger navies. So for many of those larger navies, there might actually be multi-part videos, as indeed this one will be. So with that, let's start off by looking at the first decade or so of armoured ship design in the Royal Navy, which of course means starting off with a French ship. Not La Gloire, more on her later, but Napoleon, the first purpose-designed ship of the line with a screw propeller and steam propulsion. The advantages offered by steam propulsion in terms of fighting storms, getting in and out of harbour at will, keeping speed and direction in battle regardless of the wind, and all sorts of other things, made this development almost as influential as that of Dreadnought half a century later. This set off a minor arms race as the British responded by converting old and existing ships of the line to steam, whilst planning purpose-built units of their own. The French, of course, were doing the same, and between 1850 and 1858 both sides built or converted 32 steam-powered ships of the line apiece. Massive building programs were in hand on both sides of the Channel, but two major developments occurred that realigned French thinking. The Crimean War showed the benefits of armour, at least for floating batteries, that were within close range of enemy fortress guns. And in 1856 and 1857, tests of new rifled guns showed a degree of new power being introduced to shot and shell that, when combined with the Crimean experience, convinced the French naval architect Dupuy de Lome to propose a new kind of ship. Now, to be clear, some kind of ram, frigate or floating battery with armour plating had already been proposed by numerous designers in numerous countries, but Dulhomme and his associates had a minimum list of requirements for an ocean-going ship protected against the iron and steel shot that the latest French guns could fire, and thus this would represent a full ship-of-the-line role-type vessel, or what we might call today a battleship. The ship would need to have a speed of at least 13 knots, at least 4 inches of iron armour, its gun ports would need to be at least 7 feet above the waterline, a stern would need to be designed that protected the screw from being shot away, and it would also need a full sailing rig since steam engines at this point could only ever be auxiliary on a ship that was going to do anything other than hug the coastline and stay close to harbour. Now, at this point in history, the French were having another go at running as a monarchy, and Dulhomme managed to get Napoleon III fully on side. He then took the basic form of the ship of the line Napoleon, lengthened it a little bit, and then started covering this notional wooden vessel with iron. The ship would be fully encased end to end with 2 armour belts, 4.3-inch thickness on the gun deck and 4.7-inch thickness on the deck beneath, at the waterline, plus just over 2 feet of wood as backing. As it turned out, all this extra weight brought the gun ports down to just over 6 feet from the waterline, and without the extra semi-decorative, semi-practical features of a full ship of the line, the new ship, Gloire, was of fairly simple overall shape, and with a single deck of guns, albeit heavy ones, she was technically a frigate by the standards of the time. Nonetheless, 2 sisters were ordered, Invincible and Normandie, with a 4th, the iron-hulled Couronne, were being laid down to a slightly different design, with a somewhat more complex protection system, but also ordered in the same year, 1858, but actually then laid down somewhat later on. The reason for this mixed order was simple. France could produce iron and steel of reasonable quality, but simply couldn't produce enough high-quality iron and steel to supply the frames, hulls, and armour for 4 capital ships at once. In addition to everything else, having wooden hulls on 3 of the ships allowed them to be built at the same time, whilst the industry to supply iron hull framing, etc. expanded. And the Couronne provided valuable lessons in how to build iron-hulled ships. This lack of overall capability in French industry was also to rob them of this early lead. Dulhomme, meanwhile, went off to design the only ironclads that would technically qualify as ships of the line under the old rating system, the Magenta and Solferino, but that's a story for the French ironclad video. Now, this brings us to the British, who had not been idle, and thus the idea that found in some pop history books that Gloire stunned the Royal Navy is relatively easily falsifiable. As far back as 1856, there had been a slew of ironclad proposals, including from such elevated individuals as Admiral Napier, which focused on taking existing ships of the line, cutting them down to single-deckers, and covering them in armour. However, these had been rejected as potentially taking too much risk, since they'd take a valuable ship of the line out of action just when the Anglo-French balance of power, in steamships, was the closest to even that it had been in 3 to 4 decades. And there was no guarantee that these ideas would pan out. Additionally, there was something of a decision matrix to be solved on the materials that should be used for armour. Should you use iron or steel? And if you were going to use iron, should the plates be hammered or should they be rolled? And thus a series of tests were conducted at Woolwich Arsenal in late 1856 and early 1857. First, the material itself. This turned out to actually be an easy one. Steel plates were available, but no manufacturer could make a steel plate thicker than a couple of inches, and this offered effectively no resistance to the 68-pounder gun in any of the likely battle ranges, from point blank up to about 1,000 yards. Iron plate, on the other hand, was available at 4-inch thickness, and the manufacturers promised more soon, and it seemed that the difference between rolled and hammered plate was marginal at best at this point. The tests did, however, reveal that wrought iron shot was considerably better at penetrating armour than cast iron shot. With these tests concluded, a proposal for a small, slow, armoured corvette was put forward in 1858, but while some money was set aside for potentially building this vessel, a new kind of metal had been developed. Basically a very low carbon content, technically steel, and new elongated shot and shells had also recently been developed, and so the matter of an armoured vessel was shelved whilst these new technologies were considered for their value and possible integration into a theoretical iron warship. Then, later in the same year, news of the French ironclad building program arrived, which caused a great deal of public panic but left the Admiralty's hands tied as political dithering and some older entrenched admirals, both in service and retired, argued for and against various options. You could switch entirely to ironclads, build some ironclads and some wooden steamships, or continue with the easier to build and cheaper wooden steam vessels, and just hope the whole ironclad thing was a phase that would go away. With such a deadlock underway, the status quo, which was to build more wooden steamships, went ahead quietly in the background. There was another matter also percolating away in the background. The Americans had begun a program of 6 large frigates, let me know if that sounds familiar, which aimed to result in ships with considerable heavy armament and high speed on a single gun deck. Whilst the speed of Merrimac and her sisters turned out to be not all that much to write home about in the grand scheme of frigates, their firepower was still very impressive, and a series of British replies, Diadem, Doris, Ariadne, Galatia, Mersey, and Orlando, managed to realise both speed and similar firepower, whilst notionally only carrying just over 30 guns, thus being frigates. Their use of mostly 10-inch and 68-pounder guns meant that their broadside weight was scarcely less than that of many first-rates that carried over 100 guns, as these latter ships tended to carry mostly 32-pounder weapons with a scattering of larger guns. And they were flat-out more powerful for similar reasons than some 2-deck ships of the line. All of this came to a head in the latter half of 1858. An assassination attempt was made on Napoleon III, Although the British government had nothing to do with it, the conspirators had based themselves in London, because if there was one place the French couldn't get to, it was London, and this stoked tensions. French military personnel, sensing prevarication across the Channel, ramped up fortifications and shipbuilding all along the Channel coast, and rumours of a growing understanding between Russia and France, which was something of a turnaround given the recent war, all built to such a point that the Admiralty was able to take the government to task, with a famous statement from the Surveyor's Office reading, "Although I have frequently stated that it is not in the interest of Great Britain, possessing, as she does, so large a navy, to adopt any important change in the construction of ships of war which might have the effect of rendering necessary the introduction of a new class of very costly vessels, until such course is forced upon her by the adoption by foreign powers of formidable ships of a novel character, requiring similar ships to cope with them, yet it then becomes a matter not only of expediency, but of absolute necessity. This time has arrived. France has now commenced to build frigates of great speed with their sides protected by thick metal plates, and this renders it imperative for this country to do the same without a moment's delay." There was, however, still to be a small delay, as politics, as ever, dragged on, to the point that even the royal family expressed strong public opinion on the utterly lacklustre nature of the government's ministers. But, in the background, ever more testing was being undertaken. Further gun tests with the new homogeneous metal, the ultra-low carbon steel mentioned earlier, showed that wrought iron armour was still superior to it, or current steels at currently available thicknesses. And other tests showed that wooden backing rendered far superior results in terms of protection than simply having the iron plate in place on its own. Still other ideas about using thick sheets of rubber backed up by compressed cotton bales were also tried, as was rubber backing to the iron plate instead of wood. The idea here being that the rubber would then seal over any hole made in it. But none of these worked out quite as well as iron backed by timber. But all these tests did contribute quite valuable data. Estimates were duly drawn up for a pair of ironclad frigates in 1859, although the less forward-thinking members of the Naval Board wanted them to be built similar to Gloire, wooden ships with iron protection. The Secretary of War, the engineer Scott Russell, and a contingent of naval officers managed, by alliance, to persuade the specification to be changed. Britain's first ironclads would be iron-hulled, as well as ironclad. The specifications initially were for 4 inches of armour, 12.5 knots, guns 9 feet above the waterline, and unlike Gloire, the armour would be concentrated around the guns and engines, with armoured bulkheads closing this off. A citadel, with the ends left unprotected, but heavily subdivided against flooding. A total of 16 designs were considered, ranging between 6,500 to just over 11,000 tons in displacement. But in the end, the design of Chief Constructor Isaac Watts was chosen, with a contract awarded for one of the ships to Blackwall Shipyards at a price of £31, 10 shillings per ton. The papers were signed in May 1859 with an ambitious timetable. The ship was to launch in 11 months and be ready for sea 3 months after that, in summer 1860. Politics then threatened to rock the boat before the ship had even hit the water. Having just voted through £250,000 to fund the 2 ironclad vessels, ministers almost immediately started quibbling over costs and demanded that the armour be reduced to save money. Luckily, these technological illiterates were part of a short-lived government that fell a few months later, and the new government was somewhat saner, although the Navy would still have to fend off a few more attempts to interfere over the forthcoming months. In October, the second ship was ordered from Napier Shipyards in Glasgow at the slightly increased price of £37, 5 shillings per ton. The first ship would be named Warrior, and the second ship would be named Black Prince. As the keels were being laid down, further tests were still being undertaken, taking a look at laminated plates, newly available steel plates, and new breech-loading guns, all of which turned out to be uniformly disappointing compared to rolled or hammered iron plates and the good old 68-pounder. The forms of the new ships borrowed heavily, not from ships of the line, as Gloire had done as a basis, but from the large frigates that had been built in response to the Americans. Indeed, Warrior and Mersey, when compared side by side, can be difficult to tell apart in most depictions and photos when viewed in profile, assuming that one doesn't have a very distinctive paint scheme. Compared to the just under 6,000-ton Gloires, the Warriors were a major step up, displacing just over 9,000 tons, capable of just over 14 knots under a single form of propulsion, and topping out at what was for the time a breathtaking 17.5 knots when running under both sail and steam with favourable winds. The engines delivering a, for their time, immense figure of 5,000 indicated horsepower. Their armour was made up of 4.5 inches of high-quality iron backed by 18 inches of wood, with the only irritating issue being insistence from on high on using the disappointing 110-pounder breech loaders in addition to her planned battery of 68-pounders, which forced some of the latter to be positioned outside of the citadel. Deep in the ship, adjacent to the boilers, was a forge furnace to supply molten iron to the ship's supply of Martin's shell, a specialist incendiary device which, when fired, would spray the said molten iron about the target when it exploded. Tests showing that the fire-starting effect was considerably better than heated shot, especially when it came to restarting fires that had already been put out. The less said about the possible effects on an enemy crew from having several litres of molten metal sprayed on them, the better. Warrior hit the water first, a long list of minor changes having delayed her supposedly expedited entry into service, but still getting her commissioned before Couronne, thus making her the first iron-hulled armoured warship in the world to enter service. During the course of construction, the size of the gun ports had been reduced for safety against incoming fire and because new gun pivots allowed a greater slew through a smaller opening. And her armour had been made with very expensive tongue and groove joints, which were designed to distribute the force of impact across the entire armour scheme. But the difficulties that this imposed in both the manufacture and installation of the armour, as well as potential issues replacing individual plates, meant that this would not be something to be repeated in subsequent ships, which would carry simple slab-sided armour that was common all the way through the armour-clad age. Both Warrior and her sister were heavily subdivided inside and outside of the citadel. The rudder did lie outside, but backups to the main tiller system and spare parts were liberally provided just in case something got hit. Due to her experimental nature, the hull was somewhat overbuilt, weighing in at almost 5,000 tons on its own. A few years of iron-hulled shipbuilding experience showed that almost 1,800 tons could have been shaved off of this amount and given a hull of the same basic strength to support the ship's guns, armour, machinery and other systems. On the other hand, the ships just about escaped an idea by Captain Cowper Coles, inventor of the Coles turret system, to mount a 25-foot high armoured tower with a gun on top on the ship's stern. The idea of this was to allow plunging fire into the deck of an enemy ship, thus bypassing any armour that they might possess. This was fortunately not allowed to proceed, presumably by someone with a slightly better idea about the principles of stability than Coles, who would of course go on to design the incredibly stable HMS Captain a decade later. A light bridge on the upper deck was paired with a small 4-inch armoured shelter, the forerunner of the conning tower, but as it contained no steering or communications equipment, it doesn't quite deserve the latter title. With very stiff hulls and partially ironed masts, as well as thicker masts in general, the long, slim vessels could hold full sail in considerably stronger winds than almost any other ship. And the addition later in the decade of a basic poop or shelter deck aft rebalanced the ships to even better sailing qualities, as when brought into service they tended to be a little bit nose-heavy thanks to the fine lines of the bow. Bilge keels made them steady gun platforms, and telescopic funnels could be folded away when they were under sail power only, although extending the height of these in 1861 would give the ships a fraction more speed. Of the two, Warrior was the faster and better ship generally compared to her sister, albeit that neither were particularly agile. a product of their 6.5 to 1 length to beam ratio. In 1867, as the shortcomings of the 110-pounder breechloader became apparent and new guns entered service, they would be refitted with a mixture of 7-inch and 8-inch muzzle-loading rifles and a slew of new ancillary machinery, such as steam-powered pumps. Warrior thus set a new standard for ironclads, superior in every way to the ships that had been started before her. She would also prove to be better than the ones that came immediately after her, as the Navy Board and the politicians conspired to compel the rest of the Navy to try and build something just as powerful for much less money. This resulted in the next two British ironclads, Resistance and Defence. At just over 6,000 tons, they were far closer in size and specification to Gloire. Capable of just over 11 knots, they still had the same armour thickness as the Warriors, but carried far fewer guns, 22 and 18, respectively, on each ship. Their only real feature of note was the introduction of the ram bow, a characteristic of ironclads generally going forwards, whereas their predecessors had a much more age of sail-like overhanging or knee bow. Like Warrior, they had retractable propellers for better sailing. Black Prince's screw was fixed, but once they had been completed, it turned out their guns were only just over 6 foot from the waterline. These were followed by two marginally better vessels, Hector and Valiant, albeit that it should be noted that all of these vessels were laid down before anyone's ironclads had actually entered service. These featured slightly more guns, 24, on just over 6,700 tons, and were a little faster at just over 12 knots, but otherwise, like their immediate predecessors, they were only really fit for home defence or coastal operations overseas, as they rolled quite badly in open oceans. They also had a truly odd armour layout, the 4.5-inch box citadel just above and below the waterline, and then another 4.5-inch belt immediately above this, protecting the gun deck, but extending all the way forward and aft, thinning down to 3.5 inches and then 2.5 inches at the extreme bow and stern, although the waterline bow and stern were left unprotected. This bizarre layout was thankfully not repeated. The four smaller ships were all brought into service between 1861 and 1864, with the exception of Valiant, whose yard had never actually built a warship before this and went into administration partway through as a result, which meant that she would only come online in 1868. Fortunately, sanity was able to prevail after this short interlude, and August 1861 saw the laying down of HMS Achilles, the first true successor to Warrior and Black Prince. At just under 10,000 tons, she was a fraction heavier, she carried all her main battery within the standard 4.5-inch armoured citadel, and was capable of just over 14 knots under steam. However, whilst the basic layout was similar to Warrior, there were a number of important changes made as well. The bow and stern were simpler and straighter, reflecting the new ironclad format as opposed to Warrior's harkening back to the wooden ship era. And in addition to the citadel, she carried a 2.5-inch belt at the waterline beyond this to each end of the ship. This would offer little resistance to shot, but it would resist explosive shells that might otherwise blow inconvenient holes in the bow and stern. In particular, the stern was carefully curved in a way calculated to deflect raking fire that might otherwise smash the top of the rudder post. She also represented the first ironclad to be built in the Royal Docks, in this case at Chatham, and was laid down when Warrior was still some weeks away from commissioning, hence the uniform belt armour of all British ironclads so far being 4.5 inches. Other things were far less uniform. During construction, she went from being a 36 gunship to a 44 gunship to a 50 gunship, then back to 30 guns, and then down to 26, as the crisis surrounding the failure of the early breechloaders sent the Royal Navy scrambling to find new guns to mount in addition to the 68-pounders. Like all Royal Navy ironclads of the period, she'd be rearmed in the latter part of the 1860s with a mixture of 7 and 8-inch muzzle-loading rifles, which also introduced iron gun carriages, as all the guns heretofore had been mounted on Nelsonian-style wooden carriages that wouldn't be unfamiliar to somebody fighting at the Battle of Trafalgar. Achilles also started life as a four-masted vessel, although within less than a year of her completion in 1864 the foremast and bowsprit were removed, That actually turned out to be a step too far, and the bowsprit was put back in, and the former second mast, which was now the foremast, was moved forward sometime in 1866, after which everybody decided that she sailed well enough for now. With her guns well over 9 feet above the waterline and a very steady hull form, she proved to be an excellent gunnery ship. Later, in 1861, still newer ironclads of even greater capabilities would be laid down. But this is a good point to talk about some of the other half of the early ironclad program, the converted timber-hulled ironclads. Much of the wooden shipbuilding program of the late 1850s would never see service, either broken up on the stocks, launched straight into obsolescence and destined to mostly potter around random harbours, or else taken in hand as an expedient way to boost ironclad numbers, much as older sailing ships of the line had been converted into steamships earlier in the decade. Apart from hopefully ensuring a more rapid build-up of ironclads than just using new construction, since the ship's hulls were either fully or partially completed, they'd already largely been paid for, and thus it was thought to be cheaper as well. We'll look at the 8 ships so selected in 3 stages, as they ended up in a variety of shapes and completed across most of the decade. But the first stage was 4 two-deckers: Royal Oak, Prince Consort, Caledonia, and Ocean. Of these, Royal Oak was first on the list. She was cut down by a deck, but could not be given a citadel as it was felt that her wooden hull was too flexible. Plus, she'd already been pierced along her full length for guns. So, instead, the remaining single gun deck received end-to-end 4.5-inch armour plate, with a waterline belt of similar thickness amidships that trended down to a mere shell-resisting 2.5 to 3 inches at the ends. This all-around armour protection was also put in consideration to the view that, as a wooden ship carrying armour, she would be far more vulnerable to fire than the iron-hulled true ironclads. Carrying 35 guns and capable of about 12.5 knots, she was broadly comparable on paper with the Defence and Hector types. Indeed, she displaced about the same, just over 6,000 tons with the additional weight of her armour. The ship had been lengthened on the slipway to accommodate the heavier guns, and the opportunity had also been taken to remodel the bow and stern to the more vertical form of ironclads. Prince Consort, Caledonia and Ocean would end up displacing slightly more, just under 7,000 tons, giving 2 feet more draft. This was mainly as a result of an attempt to boost their speed by fitting more powerful machinery. But, as this machinery was also considerably heavier, the overall effect was no effective change, as all the additional power went pretty much into carrying all the additional weight. And the hull, which was thus under considerably more stress, would sag and deteriorate faster in these vessels than in their half-sister. Still, again, thanks to their ship-of-the-line origins, they carried a broadside almost as powerful as that of Warrior, on about 2,500 tons less displacement, which meant that for the decade or so they were expected to last, they should be useful enough, at least equal to the Gloire and her sisters, and latterly fairly well suited to foreign stations where no serious challenger, even to a converted ironclad, could be expected for quite some time. They also marked the debut of the conning tower in its true form, which, in true British fashion, went largely ignored, although in this case more because the smoke and thunder of the main guns of the ship itself rendered the experience of standing inside one of them during action something of a halfway house between being inside a cathedral bell whilst it was being rung and a kipper smoke shed. With their hulls designed for the weights and balances of wooden ship life, they rolled quite badly in the open oceans, but at the same time proved remarkably difficult to actually topple. You'd be safe, even in the worst storms, you just wouldn't enjoy the experience. Work on these ships started in 1860, and they took about 3 to 4 years to complete on average due to the modifications that had to be made to the already completed parts of the hulls. Still, we're only in 1861, with Warrior just about undergoing her trials, but even more ironclads were being laid down. The next pair were Minotaur and Agincourt. These represented the next step from the general principles established by the Warrior, At just over 10,500 tons, they were heavier, longer, and more heavily armed, completing with muzzle-loading rifles as their main battery from the start. They carried 5 masts, and their machinery allowed them to achieve almost 15 knots just on steam. And for almost a decade, they would remain the largest warships built anywhere on the planet. They also saw an increase in armour, both in terms of extent and thickness. Like some of the much smaller converted ships, their protection extended the full length of the ship, but whilst carried to the ends by the now familiar 4.5 inches of plate, the amidship section, which covered the main battery and machinery, was 5.5 inches thick, albeit that, whilst launched relatively quickly, they took a while to enter service, their muzzle-loading rifle main battery reflecting in-service dates in the latter half of the 1860s. This was in part due to the intention of giving them 50 breech-loading guns, but the failure of this weapon meant that a lot of time was spent experimenting with new guns before formal commission, although the ships would be ready for action in almost every other respect well before the mid-1850s had the need arisen. They would have just been given whatever guns were available. As with other ships of the period, they would be rearmed a number of times. In 1875, a refit to a uniform battery of 9-inch muzzle-loading rifles included one of the first fire directors, which was capable of allowing a single man to fire the entire broadside electrically, along with another first in the Royal Navy, the electric searchlight. These two also had a half-sister, Northumberland, which was intended to be a full sister, but a change of chief constructor from Watts to Reed meant a number of alterations were made. Instead of mainly 7-inch guns with a few 9-inch guns, Northumberland was given mainly 8-inch muzzle-loading rifles with 4 9-inch guns installed as well, 2 per side in the middle of the gun decks. This increase in weight of armament came at the expense of reducing the armoured area. The full-length belt was retained at the waterline, but on the gun deck level this was reduced to the main battery only, hence requiring the reappearance of the citadel bulkheads, at the same 5.5-inch thickness as the main belt. Later in life, amongst other heavier guns, she'd also be fitted with 4 torpedo launchers, although the short range and wandering nature of early torpedoes made this a questionably useful installation. She also carried a conning tower that was of somewhat more use than the previous ones. As we now stand on the cusp of another major technological development, it's perhaps worth pausing at this point to talk about why there was a mixture of smoothbore muzzle loaders and rifled breech loaders in these early ships, and why this was uniformly replaced, in the latter part of the 1860s, with muzzle-loading rifles, and why the Royal Navy continued with muzzle-loading rifles long after most nations had begun to deploy breech-loading rifles. The replacement of the guns was in part simply because, as armour and guns got thicker and larger, respectively, more firepower was needed, but the type of gun had a lot to do with issues to be found with the Armstrong breech loader, which had shown so much promise in the latter 1850s. Firstly, in tests, despite its much greater shot weight, the 110-pounder had actually turned out to be less capable of penetrating armour than the 68-pounder, despite what it said on paper, albeit that the latter gun, the 68-pounder, was far more capable than the average gun of its size of the period. It was a legitimately good weapon. Secondly, the manufacturing process of the new breech-loading guns gave little confidence, with almost every gun issued with visible flaws and in some cases cracks that made gunnery officers very nervous. A poorly designed breech block also led to gas leakage, which didn't help accuracy or power. The final straw was a bombardment in 1863 conducted by the East Indies and China Squadron on Satsuma clan fortifications and shipping at Kagoshima in Japan after the murder of a British merchant, and the subsequent refusal of the Satsuma clan to do anything about it. 5 ships in the squadron carried Armstrong breech loaders, and of the 21 such guns that fired 365 rounds, there were no less than 28 separate accidents caused by failures of the guns, or about 1 failure in every 13 shots. In addition, most of the shells that were successfully fired were described as going anywhere but straight forward, and as much as 600 yards to the left. And the shells themselves would often fail to explode when they eventually hit something, which was probably just as well, since what they were mostly hitting was rarely the actual target they'd been aimed at. Within weeks of receiving the action report, 110-pounders were being hauled off the Royal Navy's ships, which left a quandary. Should new breech-loading rifled guns be developed at all? Should there be a return to smoothbore guns? And should the new guns be breech-loader or muzzle-loader, regardless of whether they were smoothbore or rifled? Factoring into this in the short term was that whilst the 1850s tests had shown Warrior's armour was proof against a 68-pounder with a powder charge and iron shot, newer tests using gun cotton charges and steel shot had succeeded in getting through a Warrior-type armour arrangement. So it seemed to imply that using this new combination of shot and charge, the existing 68-pounder gun would continue to work, at least in the short term. This was further buoyed by the news that American ships were using laminated armor, the nature of this compromising the otherwise impressive thicknesses that some of them achieved, to the point that comparative tests indicated that, for example, a gun whose shot was stopped by 4 inches of solid iron plate could easily pass the same shot through 6 inches of laminated armor. There was also the acquisition of some French armor, as the Flandre class under construction in the mid-1860s had 6 inches of armour, which seemed to be quite impressive and worrying. But then the testing showed that the quality of manufacture of the French iron armour was much poorer. Warrior's armour needed 33 foot-tons of energy per inch of shot circumference to penetrate. Somewhat archaic, but that's how they measured things at the time. Whilst the French iron had only needed 16 foot-tons, which meant that for the same gun and shot combination, the Flandre could be effectively treated as carrying only just over 3 inches of armour if the gun's penetration had been rated against British plate. However, without a central organisation settling matters of ordnance, the Royal Navy was vulnerable to a degree of political influence and lobbying by private industry when it came to its guns. Theoretically, the officer in charge of the gunnery school HMS Excellent had the competency and the staff to make these kinds of calls, but as a mere captain, his recommendations could, and sometimes were, be ignored by the War Office, whose staff sometimes assumed that they knew better for some reason. This was compounded by various manufacturers producing new types of guns all the time, which were all over the grid of smoothbore versus rifled and breech-loader versus muzzle-loader. In theory, rifled guns offered greater range and accuracy, although this was of limited value in an era when iron sights and the human eye offered the most advanced fire control systems afloat, along with the ability to use powerful shells due to the fact that rifled guns retained their velocity, which would also help with armour penetration at the longer ranges of ship engagement. At this point, you're talking about the high hundreds of yards to maybe just over 1,000 yards for an especially good gun crew. By contrast, smoothbore guns offered simplicity, a faster rate of fire, less strain on the guns and their mountings, and a higher velocity at the muzzle. Effectively, at shorter ranges the smoothbore gun was superior, but as that range crept over about 500 yards, more of the rifled gun's features came into play. Many officers were of the opinion that rifled guns should be used to make up the bow and stern chasers and the other scattered few upper deck guns that would be used for distant fire, whilst smoothbore guns should be retained for the main broadside, which would be used close in once the enemy had been brought to bear. But, as it turned out, no one could make a breech-loading gun at this point in the entire country that didn't have major flaws. Whilst a number of rifling systems also proved unworkable, the Woolwich system, although itself containing a number of flaws, used a relatively simple rifled barrel insertion and a copper or soft iron set of studs to grant the benefits of rifling to the shot and shell, when it worked, without impinging too much on the speed of reload. And so the muzzle-loading rifle became the standard for Royal Navy guns in the late 1860s. These early failures of breech-loading guns in the UK would leave the Royal Navy operating such guns well after they'd reached the point of absurdity, but that's for a later video. And so, back to ships, where we arrive at the aforementioned technological change, although this would not be in ocean-going vessels, but rather in ships that were designed to be used for coastal defence. It would also see the adoption of the first armoured warships designed for a foreign navy brought into British service, Of these 4 ships, only 2 of them were sisters, and we'll come to those in a minute, but first we'll look at the 5th and 6th ships of the wooden-hulled conversion batch. With the emerging data from the American Civil War on the use of monitors and the fact that the French, at least, seemed almost able to keep up with, or possibly even exceed the British in terms of ironclads being produced in the early 1860s, the axiom of the best defence, being an oceanic fleet of great size and power, remained technically true, but only if you actually had such a fleet. The Royal Navy, in terms of ironclads, in the early 1860s, did not. And so some coast defence ships, which were normally the realm of navies who couldn't guarantee bringing the enemy fleet to battle and defeating them entirely on the high seas, were sought out. Prince Albert was one of the 2-deckers that had been slated to conversion to an ironclad and was thus selected for this job. However, as a 2-decker, she would be difficult to convert to a single-turret raft-type vessel similar to USS Monitor. Instead, Captain Cole's proposal in 1859 for an ironclad with a low freeboard, end-to-end armour, and numerous small turrets carrying the 100-pound gun was taken as the basis for the conversion. 7 foot of freeboard was considerably better than the American Monitor's several inches of freeboard, and to improve this further, a 5-foot-high iron bulwark set on hinges would be installed. These would cover up the guns, but would allow for much better seakeeping in rough weather, as the freeboard would now be 12 feet, and the bulwarks would then be dropped in action. However, due to the priority given to ocean-going ships and the sudden withdrawal of all the Armstrong breechloaders, the ship languished on the stocks. The turret layout was revised to fewer installations of larger guns, which then kicked off an argument over what the largest practical gun size was. Obviously, a turret could support a gun much larger than that which could be reasonably handled in a broadside mount purely by hand, but suitable carriages for the big guns were still under development. Eventually, the 250-pounder, 9-inch, 12-ton gun was accepted, and the ship was equipped with 4 such weapons in 4 single turrets, 2 forward and 2 aft, all on the same deck level, with a flying bridge over the front 2 and a light 2-masted rig for wandering along the coast, albeit that in theory she was seaworthy enough to deploy to someone else's coast if needed. Armour was the standard 4.5 inches with slightly thinner ends, whilst the turrets had a maximum thickness at the face of 10 inches. Displacing just under 4,000 tons with a speed of just over 11 knots, she was considered acceptable for her limited role. Despite this, she remained in active service for 3 decades or more, an astonishingly long time for a ship of this period, largely thanks to her name, which appealed to Queen Victoria, as of course it carried the name of her now dead husband, and this ensured the Prince Albert's survival well past the point that she was mostly a decorative piece, rather than any kind of serious deterrent. The other conversion was Royal Sovereign, which would actually complete before Prince Albert, and was unique in the conversions in being based on a 3-decker first-rate, as opposed to a 2-decker. Being a somewhat larger vessel to start with, her final displacement after cutting down would be somewhat greater at just over 5,000 tons, but still not close to even the small ocean-going ironclads. Whilst speed was similar, the greater volume of the ship allowed for thicker armour, 5.5 inches on the main belt, a somewhat absurdly tall funnel, and the installation of 4 turrets, but with 3 aft of the funnel and 1 forward. This forward turret was larger than the others and carried a pair of 300-pounder 10.5-inch guns, with the other 3 turrets all being single turrets carrying the same gun. Armour for the turrets was, like Prince Albert, 10 inches thick on the face and 5.5 inches elsewhere, and like the other ship, it had been planned to carry pairs of 110-pounder Armstrong guns before that weapon's failure, and the increasing sizes of other guns had led to the change, although they'd be replaced with 9-inch weapons of somewhat greater power in the late 1860s. This shift from 131 guns to 5 was quite precipitous, and the hull was reinforced with iron strips to account for the great weight of the guns, armour and turrets. A flying bridge and a hurricane deck connected all the turrets above the upper deck, and since it was the first turret ship completed, and no one had tested such protection before, HMS Bellerophon, an ironclad that we'll meet a bit later on, was called upon in 1866 to just shoot at the ship's aft turret with its 9-inch gun at point-blank range. This proved the turret to be effective in its defence of the crew inside, as the turret remained operational and unbreached. Although, in a slight nod to health and safety, they had let the turret crew actually leave before they actively shot at them. The appearance of Royal Oak and Prince Alfred would set off a significant argument between proponents of building iron-hulled turret ships with fewer, larger guns, and proponents of a more conventional series of ironclads with more numerous broadside batteries. There were also some internal arguments between the factions, such as arguments about two-gun versus single-gun turrets, the main argument there being that two-gun turrets were far more efficient than single-gun turrets since they doubled the firepower for a fractional increase in size and displacement. And there was also the fact that on an ocean-going vessel, due to the limitations of steam, a full rig of sail was still needed. Turrets would compete with the masts in terms of deck space, and the masts would either be blown away by the turret's fire, or the turret's fire would be obscured by the masts in action, which were not issues present on broadside battery vessels. Solutions to some of these problems would lead to the ordering of turret-armed ocean-going ships in 1866, a mere half-decade after Warrior had entered service, but believe it or not, there were plenty more ironclads in between where we are now and that point. Two more turret-based ironclads would come into British service around this time thanks to the American Civil War. One Captain James D. Bulloch, a Confederate naval agent, ordered two double-turreted ironclad rams at £93,750 each from Laird Shipyard, ostensibly as a private venture under his personal name. This was part of a much larger program that aimed to build an armoured fleet for the Confederate States Navy to the latest designs with the latest technology in Europe, which would then descend upon the Union fleets, break their blockade, and then impose one of their own on the northern states. With public opinion turning against the Confederate States of America, Bulloch was told that the British government would not allow them to put to sea if they were the property of a nation at war. Bulloch then struck a deal for the ships to be purchased on behalf of the Khedive of Egypt, who was known to be looking for ironclads for his own fleet, and so, as a cover story went, it was relatively plausible. But the deal he then struck with the Khedive to transfer them to CSA agents once they were clear of British waters also became known to the British government, and the ships were seized in a move of questionable legality but clearer pragmatism. To avoid lengthy disputes, the government then paid Laird's 133% of the build price to simply buy them into the Royal Navy. As a result of their origins, the ships mixed some standard British practice with other features more suited to the American Civil War's coastal regions. They had a relatively shallow draft and were quite small at 2,750 tons, with the standard early 1860s British 4.5-inch armour amidships narrowing at either end. The turrets carried the regular 10-inch facing armour and were armed with 4 9-inch muzzle-loading rifles, 2 per turret, as well as a rig of enough sail to allow them to be taken across the oceans when needed. Speed under power was relatively slow at 11.5 knots, but one of the more interesting elements was a fully built-up bow and stern for seakeeping, which combined with droppable bulwarks, as on Prince Albert amidships, which led to an odd appearance when they were cleared for action of a ship that had had a big chunk taken out of the middle. Named Scorpion and Wyvern in British service, they were, despite their small size, superior to the Prince Albert, their iron hulls enabling subdividing and their triple-bladed screws, another first, allowing a surprising range of action for so small a vessel, something their higher freeboard was able to exploit. Able to sail the high seas, Wyvern differed in having tripod masts and commensurately less rigging compared to her sister, although the ships tended to treat input from the ship's wheel as more of a suggestion and guideline rather than an actual command to change direction. Still, their good seakeeping allowed them to be deployed as overseas harbour defence vessels, Bermuda for Scorpion and Hong Kong for Wyvern, where a somewhat confused Wyvern would still find herself as a distilling vessel that might notionally have been recalled to fight a possible incursion by SMS Emden in World War I, before she was eventually scrapped at around the same time as most of the Royal Navy's World War I dreadnoughts. There was also a brief period in the early 1860s where it seemed that any and all ships would need armour to hope to survive, which would lead to a spate of smaller armoured vessels, corvettes and sloops, which do bear some mentioning. This trend did die out almost as fast as it came, but it yielded some interesting data points and the origins of yet another type of ironclad layout, so let's have a look at them. Firstly, we have the 1,743-ton HMS Research, a sloop originally named Trent and renamed, appropriately enough, for its new role. Like some of the larger ships, she was a conversion from a wooden vessel, but extensively modified with a ram bow and given 4.5 inches of armour. Anything less simply wouldn't be of any use. But this now presented a problem. The ship being small meant that going from the original 17 lighter guns to a mere 4 larger weapons would rob the vessel of anything but a small broadside. The armour protected the waterline, but could not be carried along the gun deck for any great length without compromising freeboard, or possibly even buoyancy. And so a small armoured box was built that protruded from the side of the ship. This allowed firing ports facing fore and aft to be fitted, which in turn allowed the guns to be pivoted around to fire in these directions. This was to be the start of the central battery concept, which would find later use on larger ocean-going vessels, albeit in this early incarnation there were some fairly large blind spots between the perpendicular and parallel arcs of fire. Only capable of 6 knots under sail and 10 knots under steam, she wasn't going to win any races, although combined she could hit around 11.5 knots. Her seakeeping was still pretty awful, to the extent that she had to be confined to harbour during the winters. Although this largely disproved the idea of the light ironclad, other ships had already been started in the 3 years between the start of work on research and her commissioning, which meant that the even smaller 1,350-ton HMS Enterprise was next up. She pioneered another feature that would become somewhat common in smaller ships, the so-called Composite Hull, where a wooden overall hull structure was combined with iron upperworks to offset issues with fouling, since the traditional solution to fouling, putting in copper sheathing, had an unfortunate habit of creating a galvanic circuit with iron plates and thus eating away at both the sheeting and the hull in relatively short order when immersed in seawater. For ships on home service or specific long voyages, fouling could be treated by regular visits to port. For smaller ships that might spend years on station, the composite hull form offered the best balance until anti-fouling paint could be developed, as you could copper sheet the lower wooden hull, and the iron framework, iron hull plating and iron armour was all, at least unless you're in a major storm, above the waterline and thus unaffected by the galvanic circuit. Like research, she used an armoured box and a central battery, but as she was smaller, this had to be flush with the rest of the hull, the fore and aft firing provided by setting back the hull instead of projecting the armoured box forward, with a pair of bulwark panels on hinges that were able to swing in to open up the firing ports. Armour layout was thus similar, albeit shallower due to her smaller size, although the guns themselves were actually higher above the waterline than on research. She couldn't quite break 10 knots, and carried slightly smaller guns at first until the late 1860s rearmament, which replaced the Armstrong breechloaders with 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles. She was overall a somewhat better seaboat than research, but lacked the power to make all that much headway if she ran into particularly bad weather. Next up was Favourite, a larger 22-gun corvette which would end up being just over 3,000 tons. Again, with 4.5-inch armour and a central battery, she was somewhat faster at just under 12 knots and had twice as many guns, which meant that she could actually fire in all directions at once, since 2 guns per side were dedicated broadside weapons, and they added a bow and stern chaser in the latter part of the 1870s, with the same movable bulwarks as Enterprise, serving to allow central battery fire fore and aft. Although somewhat given to rolling, her slightly greater size and power meant that she could at least sail the seas in all weathers. Finally came Lord Clyde and Lord Warden. These two were the only Royal Navy ironclads built deliberately from the keel up as wooden-hulled armoured vessels, coming in at just under 8,000 tons. No one seems to have thought this Gloire-type deliberate construction was a good idea. Indeed, the 5 such vessels of this type that had been ordered had been pared down to 2 by the chief constructor, Reed being somewhat scathing and a little bit clever with his books. They were nonetheless quite heavily protected, with full-length belts, since as wooden ships they were considered to not be able to carry armoured bulkheads. This afforded a 5.5-inch belt over the main battery, 4.5 inches at the ends, plus a conning tower with 4.5 inches of armour, and the main armour being backed by almost 32 inches of oak and another 1.5 inches of iron hull skin. Because of the wooden hull needing them to have a shorter length-to-beam ratio, despite having a third, again more power than Warrior installed in their machinery, they were a fraction slower at 13.5 knots. Another attempt to address the fouling issue was made, so they were clad in 4 inches of oak outside of the armour, onto which a Muntz metal, an experimental anti-fouling material, was attached. This was another way to try and solve the problem of galvanic circuit reaction by separating the two by this cladding of oak. Initial armament consisted of 24 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles, 10 per broadside, 1 traversing stern chaser, 2 fixed bow chasers, and another traversing bow chaser 1 deck higher. This would be replaced by a mixture of 7, 8, and 9-inch main guns of slightly fewer number later in the decade. They generally rolled completely terribly. Lord Warden was a bit better than Lord Clyde, which was rapidly sent to the Mediterranean, where the sea conditions were usually somewhat kinder. By this point, we've only just reached into 1863, and the first pair of purpose-built rams to enter Royal Navy service, Pallas and Bellerophon, powered by the then-new compound engine. At just under 4,000 tons, Pallas was small, but reasonably swift at 13 knots. Her bows were, for obvious reasons, much more pronounced as a ram bow, and in common with the smaller sloop conversions, she carried a central battery of 4 guns amidships. But as a ram, she also had a bow and stern chaser from the start, and the entire bow was plated up with the default 4.5-inch armour. Albeit that the bow wave from the said ram bow all but drowned anybody who tried to open the bow chaser gun port. The imperfect understanding of the hydrodynamics that went into making a ram bow at this point limited her speed. She'd been intended for 14 knots, but at any speed, even after alterations, she threw up great rooster trails of water from the front, which looked impressive enough, at least unless you had to be operating aboard her anywhere forward of the funnel. Still, she was pretty stable, and actually proved to be remarkably swift for a small ironclad when operating under sail at the very least. Bellerophon was much larger, at just over 7,500 tons, incorporating both steel and iron into her structure, with a full-length waterline belt of 4.5 inches to 5 inches at the ends, but going up to 6 inches amidships, with a central battery that had 6-inch armour and 5-inch bulkheads supporting 10 9-inch muzzle-loading rifles, with a further 5 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles acting as bow and stern chasers. Like Pallas, the bow was built up with armour above the waterline belt, but she did not use the central battery concept. She was faster at just over 14 knots, the new hull frame system and the use of steel dropping the overall hull weight to allow for the use of heavier guns and armour, but her initial ram bow basically made the forward part of the ship a permanent water park, and so a small flared knee bow was fitted above water, not extending quite as far forward as the ram, but helping to keep the ship dry by deflecting the upthrown water again. But it meant that the amount of spray that she threw up vertically got even greater, to the point that the ship began to be reported as, Sir, Bellerophon's bow wave is in sight, since actually spotting the ship herself beneath all of the foam would have to wait until she'd closed to considerably closer distance. A large, balanced rudder meant that she also had the agility to go with the ramming purpose. With the same sandwich construction of the outer hull as Pallas, she was formidably protected, albeit not as well as if the hull skin had been of a slightly more regular thickness and the armour thus made 7 inches thick uniformly, but it was more than enough to deal with any gun available at the start of her career. We now come to two of the last three wooden conversions. These entered service in the latter part of the 1860s, again because priority was generally given where materials were short to the iron-hulled ships. These were Zealous and Royal Alfred. The last ship, Repulse, would not enter service until 1870 and so will be covered later. In addition, there was one last smaller vessel, Penelope. These three are grouped together as the lessons of previous ships of their type were applied to their construction, which thus saw a few differences between them and their predecessors before the whole idea just died out. The wooden ship of the line hulls left had been further along in construction than those that had been proceeded with earlier. In part, this way around was undertaken so that the maximum possible lessons could be learned from converting a wooden ironclad almost from the frames up, but one of the major lessons that had been learned was that lengthening the hull didn't actually help. Whilst the ship could carry more guns and was slightly faster as a result, the wooden hull tended to sag quite badly under the extra weight of the armour and the extra moment of force that this exerted when on a high sea with large swells. Thus, with Zealous, the hull was not lengthened. It was appreciated that this would result in a smaller main battery, and so she was never intended for front-rank service, instead being destined from the start as a foreign station flagship, where simply having armour would make her the supreme vessel afloat. As she was shorter, it was felt a partial citadel could be tried, as the overall hull was stiffened somewhat by a full-length waterline belt at 4.5-inch maximum thickness, trending down to 2.5 inches at the ends. So the main gun deck had a short 4.5-inch box citadel accommodating 16 7-inch muzzle-loading rifles, this being because they completed late enough to miss the whole 110-pounder debacle. 4 more guns were mounted outside the citadel as a pair of bow and stern chasers respectively. She could make just under 12 knots under power, a result of her short length to beam ratio, although this also did make her a fairly stable gun platform, the armour being thinner than the 5.5 to 6-inch armour found in contemporary iron-hulled ironclads, as it was felt that this was all the wooden hull would be able to safely carry over the area that was required to give her adequate protection. Royal Alfred was somewhat different. The order not to lengthen the hull came a fraction too late for her, but Reed's new design style, new lighter machinery, and a determination to make the best of a larger hull, as her final displacement was 6,700 tons versus Zealous at 6,100 tons, meant that she would be equipped for front-rank duty. She had 4 bow and 4 stern chasers, double that of her now half-sister, at the same 7-inch calibre, but the main battery consisted of only 10 guns, 5 per side, but using 9-inch muzzled loading rifles. There was also a major risk taken. Armour was increased in thickness, whilst the pattern was similar to Zealous in layout overall, with the exception of a small belt at each end 1 deck higher to cover the double-stacked chase guns. Thus, the end armour was 4 inches thick, whilst the amidships and gun battery box armour was 6 inches thick, with 4.5-inch bulkheads closing off the gun deck. Although longer and carrying more armour weight than Zealous, they just about got away with it thanks to Reed cutting the overall weights imposed by other parts of the ship, like the engines, down by just enough to reduce the total strain on her hull to within acceptable tolerances. Her engines allowed for just under 12.5 knots thanks to her greater length. Whilst used on the North American station for most of her career, the strains that were imposed on her hull and power plant were such that, despite Reed's best efforts, she was still out of service by 1874, and, unusually for British ironclad, most of which was still around by the start of the 20th century, she was sold in 1885 for breaking up and scrap. Penelope was the final iteration of the small armoured ships that we've looked at earlier, clocking in at just under 4,500 tons and a somewhat unique design. In order to get her 8-inch muzzle-loading rifles in as close as possible to enemy coastlines, she was designed to have a very shallow draft. So shallow, in fact, that she did not have enough height underwater for a single screw, resulting in the introduction, for the first time on a British warship, of twin screws. Albeit that the new nature of this type of propulsion also meant she was effectively given twin sterns, which helped her agility and hydrodynamics about as much as a brick to the face. Whilst also having 2 fore and 1 aft chase guns, 5-inch muzzle-loading rifles, Her main battery was, like her immediate predecessors in the small Ironclad Club, a central battery with end-on fire possible for 1 gun per side per direction. She was also very heavily armoured for such a small ship, 6 inches of armour amidships, 5 inches at the ends, and 4.5 inches on the central battery bulkheads, with the hull having angled indents to allow for this fire rather than either the sponsoning or retracting plates of earlier ships. In order to get her draft as shallow as possible, her cross-section was almost square, resulting in a very steady boat, but one which tended to drift with the wind when under sail, as she had very little lateral resistance in this format. And that brings us to the final ship of this video, Hms Hercules. Whilst Bellerophon had brought 6 inches of plate to the Royal Navy battle line, by 1866 guns had increased in firepower consistently, with a rough rule of thumb that a high-velocity armour-piercing gun was introduced with an inch more calibre every year. The new threats were also not just from France. Whilst the US Civil War had seen 11-inch, 15-inch and even 20-inch guns developed, these were relatively low-velocity weapons that were ill-suited to piercing heavy armour plate at anything above the absolute shortest of ranges. However, Krupp was now introducing heavy guns of exceptional quality, and the Russians were even experimenting with a huge 900-pounder shot weapon. Thus, shortly after Bellerophon left Chatham, Hercules was laid down. In many ways resembling a scaled-up version of the slightly older ship, her ram was of a different shape in order to reduce the bow wave, and she tipped the scales at just over 8,500 tons. Her machinery allowed for just under 15 knots of speed, but she adopted the central battery layout from the smaller vessels, with 8 new 10-inch muzzle-loading rifle guns in the central battery, with aligned gun ports allowing for fore and aft fire on either side for 1 gun in each direction per broadside. A single 9-inch bow chaser and a corresponding gun aft were complemented by a pair of 7-inch guns at each end, 1 deck higher. At either end the armour was layered 1 deck higher than the waterline belt to protect both sets of guns, but the armour overall was much thicker than anything that had come before. 6-inch plate, heretofore the maximum thickness of anything except for turret faces, was reserved merely for the ends of the waterline belt. This increased to 8 inches thickness on the main run of the hull approaching the machinery in the main battery, and the main battery itself was protected by 9 inches of armour plate, with a 6-inch bulkhead forward and a 5-inch bulkhead aft. These thinner bulkhead plates were allowed on the basis that angled raking fire would, by its nature, impact at an angle, and thus the overall effect of the armour bulkheads would be increased, and end-on raking fire would first have to pass through the 6-inch plate that was protecting the bow or stern chasers, and thus would be much reduced in velocity by the time it reached the bulkheads. She also had 2 layers of iron hull plating, and teak in between all of these layers, adding up to a total of 11.5 inches of iron and 40 inches of teak. Although, as mentioned before, this form of layered protection would not have been as effective as a single plate of the same thickness. But in tests, it was still able to resist fire from a Krupp 600-pound shot gun. Whilst all the ships we've mentioned before would receive various minor modernizations in their careers, usually including the installation of power steering and powered pumps along with new guns, Hercules was one of the oldest ships in the fleet to receive what might be described as a significant modernization. Experiments with Bellerophon had shown fitting 1890s era breech-loading rifled guns with long barrels didn't work all that well, and so her main battery was left largely in place, but she received new triple expansion engines, and the upper guns were replaced by a wide variety of quick-firing anti-torpedo boat and anti-shipping weapons. The masts were removed, the funnels increased in height and raked backwards, and a small bridge was installed, which left her looking like a slightly odd cruiser until you spotted the old 10-inch guns in the central battery. In this guise, under the questionable moniker of third-class battleship, the idea being to have something to bring to bear if all the modern ships managed to kill each other in a war, she was kept around until 1904 before being turned into a depot ship and then a training ship, and then finally being scrapped, believe it or not, in 1932. But, in terms of our progression of Ironclad development, we're still in 1866. But in this year, everything would be thrown into contention once again, as there would now be a long and extensive debate between the merits of turret ships and central battery ironclads, with both being built at the same time, along with a single remaining wooden ship of the line conversion. And then of course you also had sails versus no sails throwing its hat into the ring. In just over half a decade, the world had gone from ships Nelson would have recognised, bar the funnel, to ships that were practically immune to the older ship's fire, and then to ships that were just as immune to those early ironclads' fire, and just as deadly in return, as those vessels had been to wooden vessels. This would set the pace for much of the rest of the 19th century, albeit that the speed of development would now tend to come in bursts and then take a break for a few years. But all of that is for another time and another video.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.